I had a bet with Steve, you know, and having spoken after Adam for about 30 years, I asked him if he would put on the table all the money in his pocket, and I would do a 3-to-1 deal here. I'm always trying to raise money for one cause or another, but he wouldn't do it for some reason or another. I just want to say, there's a picture in the Capital Times from about 30 years ago where Adam and I, among others, are standing on some pillar in front of the library. I think Paul Soligan was the third person, pointing in 3 different directions as we're leading this march or about to up State Street. Now, some of you here, unfortunately, and I wish this wasn't the case, probably were regaled by Adam or I or Joe at one point or another 30 years ago in B10 Commerce or in front of the Union or someplace. So I think, in that regard, I think it's very sad that we're here today again. The other thing is a question of blame. I was just listening, and I was struck by the Wisconsin and Southern Railroad. You all know that. That's that wreck that's out here in the city. And 30 years ago, as you may remember, the Milwaukee Road folded up, the railroad that was mostly serving town. Well, the other day, if you look on their website, the Wisconsin Southern's website, the president is still blaming the Milwaukee Road for lousy track and that they haven't done enough investment. They haven't been here for 30 years, but it's still their fault. So I hope in the 14th or the 10th or the 8th year of the Obama presidency, he's not blaming President Bush for Afghanistan, because by that time, just like the Wisconsin Southern, it's his fault. Anyway, in my view, the war in Afghanistan endangers the security of the United States. Our involvement contributes to civil war in Pakistan, and the war in Afghanistan will destroy the presidency of Barack Obama. And that's what I wanted to talk about. I think my colleagues have addressed all the serious and I think very important intellectual issues about Afghanistan, the area, and so on. I mean, I remember during the teach-ins, and we had a lot of information about Vietnam and Cambodia and all these things. And I think a lot of people learned things. I think we invigorated scholarship in many areas. But here we are again. So there's something that we weren't quite able to accomplish, which probably is a fundamental rethinking of American foreign policy and our role in the world. And I think Obama sort of ran on that. Now, he never did, but I think millions of people voted for him because they thought there was going to be some substantive change. So here's what Bob Herbert said in the Times Tuesday. And it's interesting because on Monday I said to Joe and everybody else, I think I want to talk about this. And then Tuesday, you get this. Here's the quote. The United States is on its knees economically. As President Obama fights for his myriad domestic programs and his dream of economic recovery, he might benefit from a look over his shoulder at the link between Vietnam and the still smoldering ruins of the Johnson presidency. So that's what he thought. That's what I think. The war in Vietnam destroyed the positive social programs initiated by Lyndon Johnson. These programs included model cities daycare, only way my kids could get daycare, and that my wife could eventually go to school and become a physician. The expansion of food stamps, which is what we lived on, and various other housing initiatives. Head Start, and of course the voting rights, which transformed the politics of the country. All of these programs were subsumed and eaten up by the war in Vietnam. The American invasion and continued escalation of the war engulfed the country and ultimately split the Democratic Party and derailed the Great Society, of course. The cost of the war, a war for which we're still paying, both in terms of monetary and the destruction of thousands of lives, all the post-traumatic stress syndrome, the drugs, the whole business, gave the conservatives the edge to undermine and underfund the social programs. And I think also, if we take a look at it, we also have to sort of see this political thing. As all of you recall, in August of 1964, when Lyndon Johnson was running for the presidency, he got up and he was being attacked from the right, not being strong enough in Vietnam, you know, and he bombed North Vietnam. And he said to everybody at the time that, you know, we had to do this, we had to be strong, and so on and so forth. And it was obviously then, although not as obvious as it was a little bit later, but it's certainly obvious now that that was a political gesture designed to show that he was tough and wouldn't be pushed around by a bunch of peasants in Vietnam. Now, I think that in many ways Obama saw Afghanistan the same way. He implied an end to the American involvement in Iraq because he could never have been elected if he'd done anything else except that. And at the same time, he appeased the hawks and the military establishment by escalating the war in Afghanistan, showing that the U.S. is not going to be pushed around by a bunch of peasants or whatever in Afghanistan. We're going to respond in this strong and manly way. I think in a different way, I say this as a joke, you know, you take a look at all the electronic stuff we have today. I think what they did is I got all the tapes and all the movies and all the stuff, and they sort of edited it and substituted Afghanistan for Vietnam because there's no difference in the justification. Outside aggression, you know, sanctuaries, Pakistan, somebody else is at fault, but it's the same stuff. You could close your eyes and substitute the word and you've got it. That's what's so depressing about this from my point of view. Now, right now, as President Obama's increased the number of troops in Afghanistan. You know, we're not going to get too involved, don't worry about it. What's going to happen if these troops begin to get defeated? Are we going to, quote, cut and run? Remember that one? Okay. And I think you're going to see that on the part of the Republican Party and obviously others, including those in the Democratic Party, who fundamentally believe that it's our right to intervene wherever we feel like it. Now, the costs currently are just a little bit less than the current stimulus program. They're a couple of $100 billion. We think, who knows, of course, because the budgets for the war have been off budget. Now think of the argument. The stimulus program didn't get passed the other day because of pork stuff, allegedly, right? And now we haven't even done that yet, okay? And we've still got this $200 billion bill out there, or more. But unlike the stimulus program, which might actually result in an investment and hence a generation of wealth, this money is just down the rat hole. And so what's going to happen is it costs more and more in terms of debt service, and veterans' benefits, and the destruction of lives, and so on. So there are other ways that this war, in my view, contributes to the destruction of this country. It's a little bit more subtle, but mainly it's the maintenance of a huge military apparatus, one that is slated to grow as the war increases, just like the last time and every time. Except each time we end a war, the military is always bigger. And it never quite gets back to where it was. So now our military is equal to the total of everybody else's military budget in the world. Maybe not quite including China, but I think it's still greater than everybody's combined. In any event, it's close. The net result of this kind of war is that it ultimately absorbs the military, the capital, the financial capital, but also the political capital of the president. Because what's he going to say, you know? There are other parallels as well. There was no excuse to invade Vietnam. The same is really true in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda is not the Taliban. Apparently, most of the Al-Qaeda people were Saudis, and I noticed we neglected to invade Saudi Arabia. In fact, we helped them get out of the country here, as you all recall. 130 people. Toodaloo, here's your ticket. Okay, so I'm not a conspiracy person, but it's certainly odd that we go after the people who didn't go after us. There's no clear objective in Afghanistan. We heard that. But even if there were, even if we were conducting this war in the most brilliant way possible, the same way the Germans conducted the war in September of 1939, they did a great job. The invasion of a country and the forcible occupation of a country is not a right that as a country we should assume. Afghanistan is no threat to this country. However, our involvement there is a threat. I have a couple of other thoughts briefly. One is on the whole issue of modernity. What makes a modern person? The Taliban clearly is looking backwards. They believe, for instance, that maybe their vision and their vision of a country is driven by a higher being. They believe women's rights should be restricted. They believe or are opposed to science. They probably don't believe in evolution. Maybe they don't believe in climate change. We don't bomb Kansas and we don't bomb Wisconsin. So, in a similar vein, 5 minutes, it's very good. In a similar vein, remote warfare, I think, will encourage those under attack to come here and deal with it. It's one thing to go blow up an Air Force base that you can see. It's right down the road, which is what happened in Vietnam. It's a little harder to figure out that some of these drones are being run from New Mexico. But if I can read about it in the paper, I'm sure everybody else can. So sooner or later, when you're desperate enough or enough people get killed, you're going to try to figure out what to do to stop it. So I think we endanger the United States directly with this kind of warfare. The excuses about Afghanistan are familiar: democracy, peace, rights, and so on and so forth. But the one thing that every American military intervention has done, including our intervention in France in 1948 when we got rid of the Reds in Marseille, as those of you who do labor history like I do may remember, but the one thing that we have done is bring the drug trade. Vietnam, okay, Colombia, and now Afghanistan. So the one lasting thing that our interventions have done is drugs. So maybe it's an accident, who knows? But I do know this: it's an easy and cheap way for people to make a living when all else has been destroyed. And that's what we have brought to the world: the drug culture and the drug industry. Now, in Afghanistan for 50 years, you had a more or less non-aligned group. My aunt, in 1950, went around Afghanistan with another woman, two of them, for 2 months. My uncle was busily building the road in the Khyber Pass. That's what he was doing there. So I talked to her. She's 93. So we had a long discussion about what Afghanistan was like. But just picture that. 2 women, 1 guide, 1 truck, a jeep sometimes a mule, alone going through Afghanistan in 1950. Now how come they could do that and now you can get killed? That's what we have brought to Afghanistan. So I think that we need to understand a couple of other parallels with Vietnam. Relatively early in the U.S. escalation, in November of 1963, right before President Kennedy was assassinated, Ngo Dinh Diem, who was the president and dictator in Vietnam, was assassinated. Someone we helped install and who we called the nationalist and so on and so forth. But after a few years, he wasn't very successful and he had all these problems. And all of a sudden, he was exposed as being corrupt, ineffective, a dictator, and undemocratic. When we put him in office, you know, he was a brave nationalist. Recently, the American government has discovered Hamid Karzai, who was a nationalist, you may remember that, honest figure and a leader, was indeed ineffective, corrupt, and not fit to lead. He may even have dictatorial tendencies. Good, there we go. It's interesting to me that our abrupt discovery of Karzai's weaknesses come at a time when he too is beginning to realize that he cannot govern when he encourages an outside power to bomb the population and then begins to criticize it. Ultimately, every nation or empire that engages in permanent war is destroyed from within. Too much capital, financial and political, goes to the war, not enough to fund support science, innovation, medical care, or a transportation network. There was more high-speed rail built in China last year than in all of Western Europe in the last decade, and there is none in this country. We are moving backwards. The war, any war, takes up more political space. Support for the war requires all other concerns be put aside to support the troops. After all, and you can hear this campaign, should we be funding these dissolute people, these people who didn't have enough sense to get the right mortgage, these people, should we be funding them or should we be protecting our troops? You can put up the ad now, because that's what's going to happen. Eventually, this will be the question, and as the U.S. puts more and more troops in Afghanistan, the question will arrive sooner. From an economic and budget point of view, the only way to avoid it and to save the presidency of Obama is to end our military presence in Afghanistan and focus our financial, organizational, and personnel efforts to rebuilding this country so we can lead by example. We cannot lead by torture, and we cannot lead by developing the smartest bombs possible. From a political point of view, the presidency will be destroyed because the citizens of this country elected Obama as an agent of change. And so far, the foreign policy is fundamentally the same, mainly arrogating to us the right to intervene where we feel like it elsewhere. The costs are enormous and will eat up the political and financial flexibility needed to bring about meaningful domestic reform. Thank you.